This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
There is a major development tonight in Canada-U.S. trade talks. Late this evening, the federal government suddenly announcing it is now rescinding its tax targeting big tech companies. The Prime Minister is saying talks can now resume. This comes just 2 days after Trump abruptly posted online that trade talks were off unless Canada dropped the digital services tax. It was just hours away from taking effect tonight when Ottawa made the announcement.
Welcome back to the Law Bytes podcast. So I spent much of the past week talking about the digital services tax, or more particularly, the Trump administration's threat to suspend all trade negotiations with Canada if the DST proceeded, followed a little more than 48 hours later by Finance Minister François-Philippe announcing that the government was rescinding the DST altogether. This was an obvious and somewhat predictable cave. Indeed, anyone listening to episodes earlier this year will know that I believed that the DST would be the first digital policy issue to be addressed, given the implementation timeline that was in place. Since I talked so much about the DST elsewhere, I thought I'd devote this episode to it too. What it is, as there is still too much confusion about it, what just happened, and what it might mean for the future of digital policy in Canada. Let's start with what is the DST. And I think it's helpful to start with what it isn't, since there does seem to be some confusion. It is a digital services tax, not a digital sales tax. So those who suggest that somehow this is a mechanism to ensure that there are sales taxes applied to digital subscriptions such as Netflix or Spotify are really several years too late. The collection and remission of digital sales taxes, or sales taxes on digital services, now dates back to 2021 and has been in place for those large streaming services, as I say, for many years now. It's also not about payments to support CanCon, the news sector, or even this notion of leveling the playing field. Now, some of that is Bill C-11, the streaming bill, or Bill C-18, the news bill. But those have their own sets of payments. The government would argue that those are not taxes in the way that the DST is a tax. And with respect to other elements, it's not really about trying to level the playing field between large digital service companies, whether Canadian or otherwise. Rather, this is really fundamentally an attempt to get more money out of large multinationals. Those are often US-based tech companies, but not exclusively so. There were Canadian companies who have been affected by the DST as well. And it does this by applying a surtax on the revenues gained from some digital services in Canada. The percentage of that tax was to be 3% of those revenues. It was to be applied on a retroactive basis to 2022, and the value was very significant, estimated by the Parliamentary Budget Officer at $7.2 billion over 5 years. Now, we do see DSTs elsewhere. There are some European, African, Asian, and South American countries that have them. They've also been long the source of controversy, or at least opposed by the United States. For example, when France tried to move forward with its DST, the U.S. immediately indicated it would respond by levying new tariffs on popular French goods like luxury items, wine, and cheese. In fact, the issue was so challenging that there were efforts at the OECD to come up with a system that worked for everyone. Now, there would be winners and losers. Some countries would gain and others would lose, because there would be some countries that would find that they would lose more tax revenue than they would gain. In other words, they had more companies operating digital services in other countries who would then be paying those other countries as compared to the number of digital services operating in their own jurisdiction where they stood to gain something. But the effort was really an initiative to try to balance things out as much as possible. Now, Canada certainly stood to be a winner. And that's simply because we just don't have that many big multinationals that provide digital services elsewhere. Now, the OECD deal came with a moratorium on new DSTs, and at the time, Canada was affected because it did not have one in place. In other words, once the countries reached agreement on an approach with respect to digital services taxes, they agreed that as they work to implement this OECD deal, that none of them would implement a new DST. However, the Canadian government became impatient and so decided to move ahead anyway, arguing, I think a bit implausibly, that it had been working on a DST before the moratorium and so that it too should have been grandfathered. Now, its approach was that it said it would implement the Canadian DST if the OECD failed to become operational. It was clearly anxious to move ahead with this. The OECD moratorium lasted for 3 years, and there was an effort to extend that moratorium by an additional year. And Canada was one of the only countries that rejected that extension. The government simply wanted to move ahead with its own DST. And so the DST goes through the parliamentary process. It passes last year. But the first payments, as I say, they were retroactive. So it was essentially 3 years worth of tax, weren't due until June 30th of this year. And so the issue began escalating throughout this year, leading to the showdown that we just saw. Now, I want to get to that showdown, but before we do, it's important, I think, to talk a bit about what the DST does cover. We talked about how it's not a digital sales tax, it's not payments in support of CanCon or the news services. And so this notion that, for example, somehow this covers streaming services, I think is mistaken. I don't believe it does. Now, the baseline applicability under this legislation was that companies needed to generate 750 million euros, that's over a billion Canadian, in global revenue, of which at least 20 million Canadian was digital services revenue earned in Canada. The digital services revenue could arise from four different kinds of digital services. First, online marketplace service revenue. That would cover the Amazons, eBays, perhaps even Airbnb and Uber. Online advertising services revenue. That could cover Google and Meta or Facebook. Microsoft would be included there. Social media services revenue. So that certainly is Facebook, TikTok as another example. And user data revenue, covering companies that collect and sell that user data. So the revenue they generate out of that. Because the thresholds involve general global revenues and Canadian digital service revenues, the companies who were likely to be caught by this involved far more than just the large U.S. internet companies, but it certainly did cover many of those, although, as I say, not all of them. So many of these streaming services, for example, are very popular, but it's not clear that they fell within any of the four specific types of service revenue. Now, the rules for each of these digital service revenue categories got very complicated very quickly. For example, consider the guidance related to the need for the digital services revenue to occur in Canada. The law required that the user be located in Canada, which the government said would be based on a reasonableness test. But that's not always easy to determine. So, for example, take targeted advertising revenues, which would require that the user be physically located in Canada at the time. But what if the user uses a privacy tool that is designed to limit tracking? Well, the government said that those ads would be excluded. Let me quote from an example that was provided by CRA. A social media platform has a user who uses a privacy filter that prevents any personal information from being collected by the interface. Additionally, the content posted by the user on the social media platform does not indicate the user's location. As the social media platform has no data by which to determine location, this user is not considered located in Canada or outside Canada. As such, the user is not a user of determinable location. Thus, it would be excluded from the DST, the revenue that came out of that transaction. What if the user ships goods from an online marketplace to Canada, but say uses a billing address that is based in the United States? CRA said that that revenue would be treated as Canadian. Here's what they said. An online marketplace has a user that participated in multiple transactions on the marketplace. Their shipping address is in Canada and their billing address is outside Canada. In such a case, it may be reasonable to conclude that the user is in Canada and outside Canada. But because of the default rule, such a user would be considered a user located in Canada and a user of determinable location. And so you can see these are just two examples. This is highly complicated, involving literally billions of transactions and advertisements, all of which needed to determine location, the revenues involved, and then the applicable potential DST that would be applied. Now, that's, of course, not disqualifying. It was going to go ahead, but it highlights just how complicated this TST was. So that is or was the DST. So what just happened? Now, as I mentioned, U.S. opposition to the DST in Canada, as well as we should note many other countries, dates back many years. I wrote a post immediately after Trump's initial comments that the U.S. was cutting off trade negotiations that chronicled years of warnings that I posted on my blog. I've also had episodes on the DST on this podcast with Itai Greenberg, a Georgetown University professor, Reuven Avinoa, who's a Michigan professor specializing in this area, and Meredith Lilly, who focused on some of the trade implications of the DST. You can go back and listen to those episodes at your leisure. Now, it seems to me that you can have many reactions to this DST battle, but surprise should not have been one of them. Canada did indeed push ahead despite efforts at an international agreement at the OECD on the issue, and it later dismissed some of the increasing friction over the issue with the US, which had been, as I say, signaling its opposition to the DST for many years. Trump is the one that took action, but his views aren't all that dissimilar from Joe Biden's on the issue, nor members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, from both parties. Further, the companies who would be directly affected by those rules were similarly responsive and expressed concern. For example, Google began levying a 2.5% DST fee on Canadian advertisers last year in anticipation of the DST taking effect in 2025. That, of course, had the effect of passing along much of the DST cost to Canadian businesses and potentially ultimately to Canadian consumers. That levying of an additional fee was mirrored or matched by Amazon, which had something similar. And Google has implemented similar things in other countries. So it's not just Canada that was being targeted in this regard. Now, I think to be clear, this was not, as some have suggested, a function of a lack of digital sovereignty or insufficient control over our own digital networks. It was pure power politics. It was about money. And Canada just didn't play its cards very well, dating back now many years. Indeed, I'd argue that the government was truly in a no-win situation. Stick with the DST, but face the prospect of higher tariffs and a potentially end to these negotiations, at least for now. Or, as they did, embarrassingly drop it, lose the projected revenue in order to get the U.S. to restart negotiations. Given the importance of a broad-based trade deal with the United States, I think canceling the DST was understandable, even if it exposed Canada's weakness in the effort to move towards some sort of final agreement. In fact, I'd been arguing that given the trade tensions with the U.S. since the election of Donald Trump, unilaterally dropping the DST in the middle of a trade battle never seemed to make much sense, as we needed the policy certainty for this issue and many other issues under a broader deal. In other words, the DST was a card that we had to play as part of those negotiations. But once we played that card by announcing that the tax would take effect, it virtually guaranteed that the U.S. would respond as it did. I think the priority should have been a broader deal. Government could have adopted a Trump-style delay for a month to give more time for negotiations, could have followed the UK model, which weaved in the DST into a broader agreement and got a commitment to a larger digital trade deal and got to keep its DST in place. But the government continued throughout these discussions its years of dismissing the trade risks associated with the DST, and I think potentially created bigger economic problems in the process, hence the decision to drop it altogether. Now, if what I would think is best framed as a digital trade debacle sounds familiar, it's because the Canadian government's misreading of the tech sector around these kinds of issues has become a recurring problem. Time and again, government leaders talk tough when proposing digital policy. They practically dare companies and foreign governments to push back, and then seem to frantically seek an exit strategy when they do. That was certainly the case, as many listeners will know, with the trio of internet laws that formed the foundation of Canadian digital policy under the Trudeau-led Liberal government. The Internet Streaming Bill, Bill C-11, which was, of course, touted as an update to Canada's broadcasting laws, first became marred in controversy over the regulation of user content, and more recently it has become bogged down in the courts when, as promised, internet streaming companies have challenged the law. So where we're at is that years after its introduction, the law has generated no new revenues. And I think it could become a future target for Trump trade threats, particularly if the CRTC follows some of the recommendations or demands that we saw some various witnesses at a recent hearing at the CRTC, where there was talk of saying keep the initial 5% base contribution from those streaming companies and add an additional 25% into various Canadian government programs. If the CRTC targets 30% of revenues from Netflix, Spotify, and a range of other services, it is going to get the attention of the U.S. government and is likely to be the next in line when it comes to some of the kind of pushback that we've seen most recently on the DST. Of course, after Bill C-11, there was Bill C-18, the Online News Act, which sparked heated opposition from two targets, Meta and Google. The government often dismissed the risks of those companies walking away from the legislation or blocking news links altogether in response to it. Yet 2 years now after Bill C-18 became law, news links are still blocked on Facebook and Instagram, and the government was forced to scramble to revamp the legislation altogether through regulation just to get Google on board. More recently, the government ignored the critics who warned that it was overreaching with its online harms legislation. Sure enough, that bill never even made it to committee for further study, as even the government's late concession to carve out controversial criminal code and Human Rights Act provisions proved too little too late. In fact, that, as Evan Solomon, the new Minister of AI and Digital Innovation, has said, the government, it seemed like, often over-indexed on regulation. That's certainly what we saw with respect to AI as an example. The government often dismissing the concerns of AI companies. Indeed, during some consultations, they were barely in the room. And that created new risks of reduced investment and a declining role for Canada in the AI space. Unfortunately, and I think somewhat concerningly, there are signals that this troubling strategy is going to continue. We've talked on this podcast over the last few weeks about Bill C-2 and its lawful access provisions. And certainly the discussion just last week with David Fraser highlighted some of the significant new costs and scope in surveillance requirements that could leave Canadian and foreign companies in a legal quagmire where they can't comply with both Canadian and U.S. laws, face significant new costs of compliance, including those U.S. companies. And I think all this leads to increased opposition to the bill into the fall, and the government perhaps seeking to find some way out, at least with some of those provisions. Indeed, the concerns extend even to some of the strategic decisions we've seen most recently with Canada and the EU. Last week, the government released a joint statement with the European Union that said Canada and the EU will, and I'll quote, align our frameworks and standards in the regulatory field to make online platforms safer and more inclusive, to develop trustworthy AI systems, and to establish interoperable digital identities and digital credentials to facilitate interactions between our citizens and our businesses. I think that suggests more of the same from the government, who in fact have also recently launched a consultation on a new Canada-EU digital trade agreement. That consultation runs throughout the fall. There was a lot of publicity behind it, but it touches on everything from AI to privacy to IP. It's really the panoply of digital policy issues, all up for consideration and the prospect of moving even closer to an EU-style regulatory model. I think that the government has too often viewed the tech sector primarily as a source of revenue for policy projects. The proverbial make web giants pay. And at times they've overestimated the attractiveness of the Canadian market and often underestimated the risks of costly regulation. There is an obvious need for smart tech regulation. This isn't about no regulation, but it is about doing a better job of assessing some of the risks, potential consequences, and coming up with a more strategic approach to regulating the sector. I think we could start by doing a better job by protecting the things that matter. It's Canadians' privacy, data sovereignty, marketplace fairness through robust competition laws. But the strategic blunders that culminated in the embarrassing decision to cave on the DST has to lead to an internal acknowledgement of a failed approach. When even your marquee policy for collecting revenues from the world's leading technology companies crashes, I think it's time to admit that Canada desperately needs a tech regulation reset. That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. That's LAWBYTES @POBox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or follow Michael Geist @MGeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe at iTunes, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening and see you next time.